When you consider the works of Boccaccio and Machiavelli, you would expect there to be little in common. Machiavelli is best known for his work The Prince, a guide to gaining and maintaining power. On the other hand, Boccaccio's most famous work, The Decameron, is a human comedy containing 100 different tales. However, these stories both share elements of realism. It must also be noted that these stories differ, specifically in their expression of morals and views on humans. Boccaccio's work maintains an idea of right versus wrong, but it allows the reader to make these judgments, while The Prince presents a guide to politics through a completely demoralized lens. In Machiavelli's writing, morals aren't significant. Instead, he focuses on practicality. In addition, both of their works require an understanding of humans and human behavior, yet Boccaccio believes in the goodness in people, and Machiavelli has a more cynical view.
Machiavelli was born on May 3rd, 1469, in Florence, Italy. He originally was a diplomat for 14 years in Italy's Florentine Republic during the Medici's family exile. When the Medici family returned to power, he was then put in jail in 1512. When they forced him to move out of the city of Florence, he then started working on his work called The Prince. After finishing that, many people referred to him as the father of modern political theory. Since then, The Prince has been regarded as a handbook for politicians on the use of ruthless, self-serving cunning, and inspired the term Machiavellian.
Giovanni Boccaccio was an Italian writer, poet, correspondent of Petrarch, and an extremely important Renaissance humanist. Just like Machiavelli, Boccaccio also grew up in Florence, Italy. He is particularly recognized for his most eternal work, the Decameron. Much of Boccaccio's earlier work was focused on his own affairs and love life. It wasn't until after the plague that he created his masterpiece. The widespread sickness took from Boccaccio all those he cared for, but in response he created a piece that chose to celebrate life. His change in writing style can best be described by a quotation from a text called The Humanism of Boccaccio. It is rather strange that the work which best represents his genius, his humor, and his wide tolerance and love of mankind should be so different to his other works, which are so involved with his own affairs. It can probably best be described by the transition and change that had taken place in his soul, and which was to serve as an indication to the later period when a nobler and graver bearing gave definition to his friendship for Petrarch and his interest and zeal in reviving the learning of the ancients. Realism in the Decameron can best be seen through the differing ideas each story and character portrays. The framework is critical to this idea of realism. Our characters escape the plague by traveling from Florence to their summer homes, each day telling different stories to keep themselves entertained. This gives Boccaccio a lot of freedom in his writing to focus on the realistic, even gritty details of everyday life, everyday characters, and everyday language. He's able to push the bounds of what society finds acceptable to talk about because of this framework and time period. For instance, he tells stories of love, adultery, and cruelty that would have been accepted poorly in the past. Most importantly, what makes these stories realistic is they touch on events that, although exaggerated, do happen in real life, whether or not they have the fairy tale endings people have come to expect. Taking a look at Day 7, first story, called Gianni and the Werewolf, we can see how Boccaccio showcases the elements of realism. In this story, Gianni has a beautiful, clever wife, Mona Tessa, but he isn't so bright. He does happen to make a good living from weaving, though. Mona decides in order to be happy, she needs to take on a lover and turns to a man named Federigo. In the summer, she spends much of her time in the villa, but Gianni rarely stays there in the evening. She begins to have her lover over and created a system of signals to warn him when her husband was there. One day, however, the system failed, and Federigo came knocking while her and Gianni laid in bed. Thinking quickly, she said it was a werewolf at the door that had been scaring her the past few nights, and in order to get rid of it, they must exorcise it. Her and Gianni then stepped to the door, and she said, "Werewolf, werewolf, black as any crow, you came here with your tail erect, keep it up and go. Go into the garden and look beneath the peach, and there you'll find roast capones and a score of eggs with each. Raise the flask up to your lips and take a swig of wine. Then get you gone and hurt me not, nor even Gianni mine." In the end, Federigo realizes what she's doing, has a good laugh, and goes to enjoy his meal in the garden. The husband is still clueless about his wife's affair, and the lovers are free to continue. As a reader of this story, you empathize with the husband while at the same time condemning him for his stupidity. This story doesn't have a happy ending or follow much of a moral basis, but rather it shines light on the realities of life. The reader can then draw his own conclusions on what's right and what's wrong. It's a perfect example of Boccaccio's commitment to realism rather than idealism. Meanwhile, in The Prince, Machiavelli moved away from ethical politics to a more practical and realistic form he created. The Prince served as a handbook for rulers, and he illustrates in his writing that he has no interest in speaking on idealism, which is incredibly different from past political writings. Dating back to Aristotle, there has always been a direct connection between politics and ethics. Machiavelli was the first theorist to decisively divorce politics from ethics and hence to give a certain autonomy to the study of politics. He dresses his commitment to realism by saying there is such a gap between how one lives and how one should live that he who neglects what is being done for what should be done will learn his destruction rather than his preservation. In order to further understand, we must take a deeper look at the principles he preaches. A great example of Machiavelli's use of realism is his discussion of fear and love. He notes that it is very difficult for a ruler to be feared and loved, but it is much safer to be feared. Although it is not idealistic, he claims, for men are less concerned with hurting someone who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared, because love is held by a link of obligations, which since men are wretched creatures, it is broken every time their own interests are at stake. But fear is held by a dread of punishment which will never leave you. Thus, Machiavelli considers both options, but understands that it is more realistic and practical for a leader to be feared, contrary to popular belief. Boccaccio's use of humanism can be tied to his portrayal of people and celebration of humanity. This differs from Machiavelli's more negative view on people. The Decameron can best be described as, and I quote, a true and realistic mirror of life in all its forms, among all classes, filled with observations of those customs and types that made up the life of the time, dramatic, comic, tragic, ironic, philosophic, and ever lyrical, indulgent of human error. It's a human book, feat in construction and freedom, full of people, of living people. Through his writing, he presented a new idiom capable of portraying all types of feelings, from love to jealousy. Essentially, the Decameron is its own world, that when read brings about a feeling of life itself. Each story is itself a delve into the life of characters and their individuality. In order to understand Boccaccio's use of humanism, we must take a deeper look at the stories and emotions of its characters. The ninth story of the fifth day is about a passionate and kind man, Federigo degli Alberighi. In this story, Federigo fell deeply in love with a lovely and beautiful woman named Mona Giovanna, but she was a married woman. He spent all of his wealth to get her attention and was left poor with only a falcon and a farmhouse, which after the death of her husband, she and her child moved nearby. Here, her son became close with Federigo and greatly admired his falcon, Federigo's prized possession. It was then that her son fell ill, and on his deathbed he asked for the falcon. Although she felt hesitant to ask Federigo, she decided to meet with him over breakfast and make amends for all that he suffered on her behalf. With great humility, Federigo responded to her apology with, I cannot recall ever having suffered any harm on your account. On the contrary, I have gained so much that if I ever attained any kind of excellence, it was entirely because of your great worth and the love I bore you. Moreover, I can assure you that this visit, which you have generously paid me, is worth more to me than all the money I ever possess. Federigo faced a problem. However, he had no possessions or money to make her a meal, so he turned to the only thing he had left, his falcon. After finishing the meal, she explained she needed the falcon to help her son, and it was then that Federigo sadly told her that they had just eaten it. Soon after, her son fell to the illness, and she was faced with the decision of remarrying, in which she decided the only fit man would be Federigo. It is an example like this that shows love, passion, and individuality of these characters that makes them human. Federigo, being a kind man, thoughtlessly offered up all of his possessions for his pursuit of love and without hesitation even gave up his most prized one. Some may argue that his emotions and actions have made him a foolish man, but it is much more sensible to conclude it is these that make him human. It is through these stories that Boccaccio is capable of expressing the idiosyncrasies of people while also celebrating these in life as a whole. He recognizes the good and bads of people, but throughout he maintains a love for humanity in all its parts. This is a huge difference from Machiavelli's work. Like Boccaccio, understanding people is critical to Machiavelli's work. He places an importance on understanding people and why they make the decisions they do in order to create a practical set of rules for leading. The large difference between these two is that Machiavelli has a poor view on people. Machiavelli writes, or this can generally be said of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers, avoiders of danger, greedy for profit, and as long as you serve their welfare, they are entirely yours, offering you their blood, possessions, life, and children. Although he is cynical in his view, he makes observations on the behavior of people that are critical to his views on politics. It is because of this that he understands the role a leader must play. In this sense, it is similar to Boccaccio's work, but it is more important to differentiate between the humanistic viewpoint in the Decameron and Machiavelli's more cynical one. Both Machiavelli and Boccaccio were talented in their writing abilities, but they did have their differences in their view on morals. When Machiavelli emphasized the notion of throwing morals out the door, Boccaccio's work maintained an idea of what is good and what is bad. Machiavelli demoralized the rules of how a leader should lead and instead focused on the practicalities around them. Although Boccaccio's stories don't always end up with a happy ending, the reader is able to comprehend the story in their own way and draw conclusions about morality for themselves. This is a critical difference between the writers and may have been influenced by their events surrounding their life while writing these pieces. Machiavelli had been jailed, tortured, and later exiled out of Florence by the Medici family previous to writing his book. I believe it is because of these events that Machiavelli's view became hardened and moved away from ethical thinking. On the other hand, Boccaccio also faced a horrible fate due to the widespread sickness that took his friends, family, and people of all kinds. It was during this time, however, that Boccaccio chose to write a book that instead celebrated life. It's counterintuitive to believe that a humanistic writer like Boccaccio and Machiavelli would share similarities. However, both of their most famous works stay true to the principles of realism. Boccaccio told stories that focused on the realities of life, while Machiavelli created a set of realistic rules rooted in practicality and backed up with examples. In both of these pieces, the elements of realism trumps idealism. However, they do differ on their moral basis and views on humanity. In The Prince, Machiavelli takes a look at politics from a completely demoralized view, while stressing the importance of achieving certain goals over the morality of the means to do so. In addition, Machiavelli's view on people was that they are self-interested, and rather untrustworthy. He notes that a good leader must understand this and have the virtue to counter it. On the other hand, Boccaccio maintained an idea of good versus bad in his stories. Although they did not all have happy endings, the reader is able to interpret the morality of the characters' actions. Lastly, Boccaccio was a humanist who loved humanity as a whole and celebrated it in his pieces. In these ways, these two authors, in their most famous pieces, differ entirely.
Davanti al golfo di Sorrento un uomo abbraccia una ragazza dopo che aveva pianto, poi si schiarisce la voce